Have you ever said to someone, look, you're entitled to your beliefs, but don't push your beliefs on me. You can have your morality, but don't be legislating your morality for everyone. Maybe you haven't said it yourself, maybe you've just heard it from other people, but it is a sentiment that I've heard expressed a lot lately, and it's one that I don't actually agree with, and I haven't really heard my perspective being voiced that much, at least publicly, and so I want to go ahead and do that. I think the big problem with this mindset is it is ignoring the entire purpose and function of a society, which is to come together under a common value system, a common set of laws, and live together in harmony, which involves a common morality. So I think what we run into when we have these discussions of don't force your morality on me is more of a disagreement about morals that needs to be hashed out. One thing I think is often the underlying issue is that liberty is a very core value, particularly in the US. A lot of people came to the US because they were fleeing some sort of government persecution or religious persecution, or they wanted the ability to express themselves freely and live in peace under their own values. And I think that's very legitimate, but I think in that case, the argument you're making is not that you shouldn't legislate morality, but that liberty is the core morality at stake and that it's potentially more important than whatever other issue you're talking about. Because if you value liberty, I think you do want to legislate that. You do want to have these laws in place that are preserving your right to freedom of expression, to freedom of protest, freedom of religion, all that stuff. And you also want to have the proper punishments in place if some sort of person or organization is trying to infringe upon that. And what I was talking about there, I think touches on another sort of underlying issue, which is that when you are saying to someone, don't legislate your morality, I think oftentimes the core problem is competing moralities that you disagree with another person. I think bodily autonomy is a very interesting example of this lately because we see that on both sides of the aisle, that I think when it comes to the question of abortion, you see a lot of liberals are of the mindset of your bodily autonomy, your right to decide if and when you want to reproduce is a more important moral that takes precedence over the fetus's ability to continue to develop into a baby. And then, of course, we saw it all the time when the COVID vaccines came out and there was this whole, like, what happened to my body, my choice. You see on the right, it's typically on the right, that there's this idea of I should have the final say over what you are injecting in my body. You should not be able to be forced to inject something into my body or threaten me with losing my job. Whereas on the left, there's this value of herd immunity and of this universal protection that by getting the shot, we are improving all of society. So again, what's happening is not this idea, don't legislate your morality, as it's a disagreement on what the morality should be. And I think another thing that follows on that too is this idea of lifestyle choices versus actual morality, and sort of a middle ground too, that I think if someone is doing something and I sort of it squicks me out, but it's just more of like a personal thing, like I don't like to see people do that, then I think we can tend to see that as a lifestyle choice. And a lot of us, I think, can understand why you would not want to legislate lifestyle choices on other people. And then I think you also get into more of weak morality. I don't know if you know what I mean by that. Like, for instance, I think a lot of people would value honesty, but if someone told a little white lie, you sort of reach this point where you're like that's not quite right, but it's also not sort of at the extreme of needing to be punished. But I think when you really truly believe something's wrong, you do believe it is wrong for everyone. And one example I really like to use with this is child trafficking, because I think there's pretty universal agreement that that is wrong. And so if you were to imagine that some state decided that child trafficking was not that bad and they wanted to make it legal, you wouldn't be like, you do you. You'd be like, no, that's wrong. Don't do that. And so I think we all sort of understand on a really sort of instinctive level, like, yeah, if something's really wrong, that's immoral, and you do want to legislate that. And so this idea that that you should not be pushing your beliefs on other people, I think is just sort of wrong. Well, maybe let me clarify. Like I said, there are some beliefs that I think are sort of personal enough and weak enough that we can all understand, like, no, that's not cool. You shouldn't be pushing that on other people. But I think where the disagreement comes in is the difference between personal beliefs and your true underlying values and morality, because that is really the functional basis of society. And if you are seeing someone doing what you believe is unfairly pushing their beliefs on other people, I think it's a fundamental disagreement about how seriously you take those values and how sanctimonious that particular value is to you. And so really, at the end of the day, if you're saying don't legislate morality, you're glossing over the real issue. The real issue is that there's a difference in between your values and that other person and the other groups, and you really need to be hashing that out.